Welcome to the UIUC Talkshow. Our goal with this show is to introduce you to the most interesting people with the most interesting ideas. Today we have a very special guest, Dr. Gupta. Welcome.
Thank you. It's exciting to be here. Thanks for having me.
Especially exciting after coming back of a year of sabbatical. So tell us how that went. I know you spent some time in Europe, you started a podcast. Tell us about that whole experience.
Yeah, so the sabbatical allowed me to focus on a project that I've been wanting to do for a while, which is to interview several prominent computer scientists who are well known now in the computer science field, but they did not grow up in the US. They grew up in all other parts of the world, everywhere else. And so these are human interest stories where I interviewed them. These are called as oral history interviews. So essentially, over the last year while I was in sabbatical, I interviewed 20 to 30 different computer scientists. We are on episode 43 of the podcast. The podcast is called Immigrant Computer Scientists, csimmigrant.org, or csimmigrant on all social media. It's available on Apple Podcasts and everything else. So that's kind of what I was doing over the last year. It was a very different experience for me. It was not as technical a work as I'm used to. It's not research, certainly.
Right.
It's not teaching. But it is technical in a different way because and it's an audio podcast, unlike this podcast where you have video, it's an audio podcast, and I'm particularly picky about how audio sounds.
So I could tell after listening to the episode.
Yeah. So I spent a lot of time editing the episodes, ums and thus and things like that. I would edit those things out. Because I wanted it to be pristine. Partly because also the contents of that podcast are being archived by IEEE as a part of this podcast project. So they have mirror pages of every web page that I set up for every episode. So that's part of the goal as well. So I wanted it to be really good, something that would hold up in posterity and would be useful for everyone listening to it. Along the way, I also did some travel, like you mentioned. I spent last fall semester 2021, I spent as a visiting faculty at UC Berkeley, and then past summer, I was a visiting faculty at Max Planck Institute for Software Systems in Germany. I was supposed to spend a few more months in a few other places, but the pandemic got in the way, so I stayed put and focused on my episodes. So that was kind of what I did most of last year. It's very different. We were talking about this just before. There's a lot of interviews of technologists, engineers, about their work and about technology, but it's much rarer to find human interest interviews where you ask someone about, hey, how was it like growing up where you grew up? What was it like coming to this country? Was your English fine or was it different? Did you encounter, or do you still encounter, imposter syndrome? How do you deal with failures? I interviewed about half the episodes feature women computer scientists, and so I would ask them questions about what was it like being a woman in your country doing computer science, and sometimes it would be like 70% of students in my batch in my country were women. I was like, wow, that's not the US at all. The US is like less than 20%, right? So there were surprises like that along the way. And that's partly why I did the podcast as well, to bring in different perspectives than we are used to here in this country, where every study we have here of diversity in computer science or in engineering is pretty much US focused, right? Actually, the idea for the podcast also started when I was reading this very famous book called Unlocking the Clubhouse. It's by two researchers at Carnegie Mellon University, Margolis and Fisher. And they wrote this book based on many interviews and surveys they did of undergrad students in computer science at Carnegie Mellon. And they asked them, what was it like growing up and, in your household and things like that. And I was reading this book. It was very, very interesting. And I was reading this because I was very interested in the diversity problem in engineering, where, we have less than 20% of our students are women in computing, and it's similar in other branches of discipline, in other branches of engineering. And the same thing, if you look at African Americans, Native Americans, all the underrepresented populations, they are really underrepresented. So, and that remains an unsolved problem in this country. So I was reading that book, and as I'm reading the book, I'm reading some of the anecdotes and the conclusions from the authors. And the conclusion and the anecdotes go something like, a large majority of male students grew up with computers in their home when they were growing up. And I'm sitting there thinking, that was not my experience growing up in India. And so I said, oh, maybe I'm too old. Maybe it wasn't like that in the 80s or 90s when I was growing up. And so I asked some of the grad students in our department who came from other countries, like, did you have a computer at home? When did you encounter your first computer? When did you first write your first line of code? And many of them were like, college, work, things like that. And I was like, okay. So clearly the studies we have here are very much biased by the experiences of Americans, and a new perspective is needed where we bring in perspectives of how people came into engineering or science or computing or programming in their own countries. Right? So that's one of the reasons why I started the podcast. But along the way, we unearthed a lot of other things that people wanted to talk about as well. So it's been a very eye-revealing project to me because every single interview is very unique. Every person very different. I've interviewed like groups of people from the same country. Like every episode I do on a country, like we did an episode on Israel, and I interviewed 3 different Israeli-American computer scientists, and they all immigrated to the US at different times. Like one immigrated in the 70s, one in the 80s, and then one in the 90s. So very different decades, so very different experiences. And every one of them is, again, they have just very different reasons why they immigrated, why they stayed here. And even within an interview, like every 5 minutes, I would be surprised by something they say. Like I would ask a question, they would say something. I was like, okay, ditch that question. Let's go down this rabbit hole. Let's talk about this one, right? So that part was very, very exciting to me. So I really had I don't want to say fun because some of the stories are grim, others are funny, others are just like very different. But it was a very overall. I think I'm very glad I did that project. It's very different. I certainly knew that when I started it in fall 2021, a little over a year ago from now, I was asking myself, should I really do this? Like, this is way outside my comfort zone. First off, I don't know how to edit audio. I've never used Adobe Audition, or any of these other software before. And then second, I don't know how to interview people for human interest stories. So I went and watched, I read some journalism articles, but there's not a lot of stuff there that is accessible. And then I went and watched this very nice interview of Larry King, who's very well known as an interviewer. There was a very nice interview of Larry King done by someone else. I think the other guy was Sussman. I don't remember his first name. And in that, actually, he asked Larry King, like, what is your approach to doing interviews? I actually learned a lot from that. I think I listened to that episode a lot of times. I took a lot of notes from that. I think that helped me a lot. But then along the way, as the interviews kept going in my podcast, I kind of developed my own style. And so I enjoyed that a lot, which is why I love your show as well. You're doing human interest stories here, which again, I think need to be amplified more in the world.
Did you have time to work on programming projects, or did you do any programming with your podcast? I mean, for instance, I do a lot of the editing with, I've written some programs to help me with the editing. So I'm wondering, do you do any programming with the audio or like the podcast at all?
Not a lot, because I was doing most of my interviews online, via Zoom, and I was very attentive because, it was COVID time, so it's not possible. And plus, all my interviews were halfway across the world or halfway across the country. And so there was, so the short answer to your question is no, I did not do any programming, but I had to kind of prep myself a lot to capture very high quality audio. Because if you capture very poor quality audio, you guys know this, right? If you capture very poor quality audio, it's shot, right? So Zoom is pretty good for that, and there are other software that's good for that, but Zoom is good enough actually if you know the right settings to do in Zoom. So that took me a while. There's an online community of podcasters that I was tapped into who gave me the right tips for that. But then, coming back to your question, I think every episode was very different and unique in its background noise, background sounds, and things that needed to be edited. A lot of it was just manual work, sitting and just going through the episode and going through it with love. I think that's the way to describe it, right? So I think if I was not passionate about the project, I would not have sat through those hours and edited those episodes. I really wanted that to sound very pristine in the end.
Did you plan this before you took the sabbatical, or did this happen? Did this revelation happen like while you were in the sabbatical at Berkeley?
I did plan for it before the sabbatical. In
Okay.
fact, like when we apply for when faculty apply for sabbatical, we are supposed to write a sabbatical
Reason?
application actually, and you're supposed to submit the sabbatical application like almost 8 months before you actually go on sabbatical, and then it actually gets reviewed by the campus, and they might actually deny your application. That happens too. Typical sabbatical applications go like, I'm going to go spend X months in this place and then Y months in another place, start up some research projects, or I'm going to spend X months in a company. My sabbatical application was, I'm going to start a podcast. Here's what it is. So that was it. That's essentially what I wrote. And I was very impressed by this campus. They looked at their application, they said, okay. Which is amazing because they are actually paying a part of my salary during my sabbatical year. And they were fine with me actually not saying in the sabbatical application that I would start up new collaborations or go to a company. I said, I'm going to spend some time here, but that's not the main product. And they were okay with it, which is a great sign for a campus like this. I think the fact that they value diverse activities, they value human-facing activities, even in a college of engineering, right? That was a very good sign, and that made me feel very welcome. So so that's the long answer to your question. Yes.
So like that means like you knew about this since the beginning of 2021. Like you had started planning this.
I did, yes. In fact, my original idea for doing the podcast was born in around 2020 when I was starting to think of what would I do in my sabbatical. And initially, I wanted to do a podcast focused purely on women in computing, right? And as part of this, I was reading this book that I described, and that's what caused me to kind of broaden the scope of the podcast to cover immigrants, and through immigrants as well. I interview about half the episodes cover women, and we cover a lot of other experiences of women who grew up from outside the U.S. So I kind of broadened the scope compared to that. And part of the reason that I broadened the scope also is because as I was doing my research, when my original idea of women in computing came over, I actually found that there's at least one well-known oral history project of women in computing that was done in the early 2000s. It's very well documented. It's also archived by ACM. And there were about 50 plus women who were interviewed, very, very well-known women. And so I read through a lot of those interviews in order to kind of understand, what do these interviews look like and what were the experiences. But I didn't want to replicate that, I wanted to do something completely new, which is why I brought in the scope as well. But yeah, the short answer to your question is yes. I kind of knew that I wanted to do something along the lines of creating an oral history repository well before the sabbatical.
And I think like podcast is a very powerful way to do that because I know it's picking up, like a lot of people are doing that, but like if you do it right, like you can bring out some wonderful conversations with people. And so I want to ask you, what is something unexpected that came out of this year-long experience of talking with these scientists from around the world? What is something unexpected that you found to come out of this?
You mean like things that
you weren't expecting to like happen, or that just happened as a consequence of you talking with these people? And
quite a few unexpected things. I mean, I think every interview I did has surprising revelations. When I prep for an interview, I know some things about my interviewee. I mean, I do a lot of research and I prepare my questions specifically for that interviewee. But then along the way, they reveal a lot of things about their life, and that always becomes interesting, right? But one of the things that really surprised me along the way is not about the interviews themselves, but about people's reactions to the entire project, including my own interviewees. As I'm sure you have experienced, you send out invites and some of them say yes, some of them you never hear back, and others are like, I'm not sure, whatever, right? And so, your mileage may vary in terms of what fraction of people you have saying yes. In my experience, the thing that surprised me the most is that the folks who said yes said a very enthusiastic yes. They said, yes, I will appear on your podcast. Not only that, I will also, your project is great. We need more of this. And I'm going to amplify this and publicize it even more. Not just, my episode, but everyone else's episode. A few of the interviewees, when I invited them, they're like, I know your podcast. I've been listening to it already for 6 months. So I was waiting kind of for your invite. That surprised me a lot. So that was very, 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 very surprising to me. I did not expect that. Partly also I did not expect that because of the second surprising aspect, which is even though podcasting is a very technical thing, whether it's podcasting or talk shows or whatever on YouTube, one of the things I discovered very quickly after I started releasing episodes is that computer scientists, who at least the ones who are on social media, don't listen to podcasts all that much. I mean, they listen, but only select podcasts. There's a lot of them who don't even know what podcasts are. I'm actually ashamed to say that, but it's true. It's true of like a lot of computer science. Like some of them are well-established computer scientists. They're like, podcast? Is that like on YouTube? I'm like, no, it has only audio. So part of what I was doing with social media was also kind of like just bringing people into the podcast listening world. Some of them, yes, some of them had been listening to podcasts for years. Those who had been. But others were like, I don't know what a podcast is. My life is too busy. So that was the other surprising thing, right? So, but I think over time, we got more listeners in who were listening, who had never listened to a podcast before, including some of my own friends, right? And a lot of people, because of whatever, a lot of people think that podcasts or talk shows like yours are, you have to pay some money or something to listen to them or watch them. It's like, no, it's all free. We are doing this on a volunteer basis, right? And some people can't believe that, things can be free. People are like, oh, there's no free lunch in this world. But sometimes there is, we do it for a reason, right? The two of you and I, we do our own shows for a particular reason. We have our own motivations. So I think that was the other surprising thing about the group of listeners, I think, that surprised me. I didn't expect that. But apart from that, every story is just very, very unique. Every story is very, very different. I spoke with people who lived through the communist years in communist countries, grew up in Romania, Moldova. They described communist experiences. They described the communist government keeping folders about their family. They described not being able to have enough money to buy eggs. And they describe their parents creating a game where you fish behind the sofa looking for the coins so that you can go buy bread. Some of them actually lived through that, and now they're professors here and well-known entrepreneurs here. I've talked with some people like that. There are episodes like that. Then there are episodes of people who grew up in very repressive regimes, not communist, but other repressive regimes in the Middle East. And in spite of that, they founded companies in those Middle Eastern companies, in Middle Eastern countries. And then they moved to North America, and then they founded another company over here, right? So they're like serial entrepreneurs, but in like different countries, very different challenges in the different countries. I spoke with people who suffered illnesses when they were small. One of my guests had tuberculosis when he was like in early kindergarten, early primary school, and he missed like 2 years of school. And he said, in those 2 years, I essentially read the atlas, and that's why I'm a geography buff now, right? And another one of my guests survived breast cancer, and that changed what she does in research. She had one of the best answers. So I asked this question to everyone: how do you handle imposter syndrome? How do you handle failures? Imposter syndrome is where you feel like you don't belong where you are. If you're a computer scientist, you're like, I'm a fake. Everyone around me is much better than me. I don't really belong here, right? So I asked this question on all of my interviews. And I think this guest who was a cancer survivor had one of the best answers. And her answer was, it doesn't matter. I'm a vehicle to achieve the goal of this research. If it was someone else in my place, they would just do the necessary thing to continue being the vehicle for this research. So it doesn't matter whether I'm good or bad. I'm just going to continue being a vehicle for this research. So actually, she does research now on oncology and on medical informatics. So her recovery from cancer actually changed her experience. So there's a lot of very diverse stories like this in the podcast. Stuff that doesn't get talked about, right? If you go to a conference, you talk with someone, technically, they're not going to tell you about all their deep stories, right? That's the other thing that surprised me, going back to your earlier question, that the folks who came on the podcast, when I asked them questions, it's not like I asked them probing questions. I don't ask them, did you ever suffer a disease? I don't ask them that. I just ask them very basic questions like, what was it like, growing up? They actually revealed a lot more of themselves than I thought they would. And partly because I think they felt comfortable in a safe space, but also partly because they felt that these experiences they had would actually inform others in the broader community, not just computer scientists and students who are growing up to be computer scientists, but like everyone else, like really, right? Because after all, we're all human beings at the end of the day, right? So that's the other part that surprised me, that every single, I don't think I had a single episode where I started the episode and then partway through the episode, I'm like, this person is setting up a wall between them and me. That never happened. I expected that to actually happen. It never did. There was never a wall, ever. It was always like they were revealing a lot more than I could process, right? So that was kind of surprising to me. It partly is also correlated with the fact that the folks who agreed to come on the podcast were already very enthusiastic about the entire project anyway. They said, we should be talking more about immigrants and computer science and immigrants in general in this country, right? Because immigrants do contribute a lot to the economy of the country, and there's a lot of studies. Actually, I spoke with a few. I mean, I don't do research on the social science and economy side, but I did speak with a few economists in our campus who do research on that. So there are research works that investigate, for instance, why is it that Asians, for instance, gravitate more towards math and science, right? I mean, there's no silver bullet answer to that question. Why is it that immigrant Asians migrate more towards math and science? Is the performance of boys and girls in math and science really all that different, right? There's actually studies that process data from tests across the world, and these are actually published in well-known economics journals. So I spoke with a few of them, and the questions that I was asking them, they're like, yeah, we don't have answers to that. We have answers to other things, but not to this. Things like, why are there fewer women in computing? There is no data answers to that, right? There's a lot of theories, but there's no answers to that. So that was part of the prep for the podcast as well. But it's a well-studied but a less understood area, and anecdotal stories and real experiences, I think, add more to that area. That's kind of what the podcast was.
What's a question that we can ask you, or what's a question that you enjoy answering, or what's a question that we can ask you that would reveal really interesting things about you?
About me? You can ask me any question. I'm a pretty open book.
I'm wondering because it's kind of a very meta in the sense of like interviewer.
Yeah.
So I'm sure you can think of a question that we can ask you in the sense of it would reveal something that we would otherwise get revealed.
Yeah. You could ask me, what else do you do in life apart from your professor job and this podcast?
What else do you do besides?
There you go. I'll give you a short answer to that. So I love music.
Oh.
So
same.
Yeah. So I've hosted here. There is a community radio station here, WEFT 90.1 FM in downtown Champaign. When I was an assistant professor here, just a couple of years here, I got involved with that community and I started hosting a show there. The show is called East of Zero. I play music from all lands east of 0 degrees longitude. That's why it's called East of Zero. But it's also intended to be very uplifting music, so it's a double play on words there. So it's Tuesday nights, every Tuesday night, 10 p.m. through 12 a.m. Everyone can listen to it. It's free. It's available online. You can also listen to past couple of weeks of recorded shows. Just search for East of Zero on Google or whatever. That's one thing I do on the side. I also try to learn like new musical instruments every few years. And so that's something that I used to do as a child. I learned some instruments, but never as a professional. I'm not a professional in any of the instruments that I've tried. But then off late, I think I've tried to pick up more instruments. And so this is right before the pandemic, actually. There's actually quite a few musicians in our department, the computer science department. Some faculty, quite a few students, a few postdocs. So we actually got together and we said, let's have a band. And so we created a band. And we created a band for a particular occasion, which was the visit days of our grad students. So these were prospective grad students we had admitted who were visiting. This is March 2020, like right before the pandemic.
Before.
In fact, it's the last in-person event in our department before we all went fully online. Our department head still tells me that. And so we practiced for actually quite a few weeks. I think there were like 8 or 9 musicians. Our band was called Virtually There, but we were in person. And so we performed in the Maze restaurant, which is in downtown Champaign. We rented out the entire restaurant for the group of visiting students, who were about 100 or 100 odd students. And we performed a set of about, I think, 40 minutes.
Wow.
7 or 8 songs. I was playing the ukulele and the vocals. And then there were a couple of musicians who are like professional musicians, guitarist, and then one of my colleagues who is a trumpet player, and a few others. But the interesting thing of that was that we did songs, we actually rewrote song lyrics to make them more engineering and computer sciencey lyrics. So every single song had completely new lyrics intended to be funny, but the tunes were like, the well-known tune. So for instance, like one of the algorithms I teach in class is called the Lamport timestamps algorithm. So I rewrote "You Are My Sunshine" lyrics to essentially capture the pseudocode of the algorithm. It's the video is there on YouTube.
Right.
Anyone can watch it, and it's actually one of probably my most liked video at this point. But I think I've also heard students actually listen to that just to remember, okay, this is what the algorithm does, so like an exam question, right? So that's one of my things that I kind of started doing. I don't know what led me to do that, but only over the last like 5 or 6 years is something new I discovered. Where I would listen to a song and be like, yeah, that song, that sounds like I could rewrite it for some other purpose. Like there was a song, a very famous song called "Stuck in the Middle," very old 80s, 90s song. So listening to that song, I'm like, okay, that kind of describes my experience of reviewing papers. Let me just rewrite that song lyrics in terms of a researcher reviewing papers. And again, that's again on YouTube as well.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So that's kind of, music is my passion. That's one of the other things I like to do on the side. Long short answer to your question.
I'm wondering to hear your thoughts on this question. So this week we've been going to this tech conference around here. So since about Monday, this whole week we've been going to this conference. And yesterday we met this very famous person. He's written many books, and you probably know this person. But so we basically, like, long story short, he was saying, like, don't do your talk show because it's a very short-term thing. Just do things that last a long term. And I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on, like, what's the difference between, like, how should you focus your time, meaning how much of the future should you think about, and how much should you think of, like, what do you make of working on short-term projects, long-term projects, and how you think of that question in your personal life?
I will say 2 things. One is, I think it's very important to be doing things that you want to be doing, that you really like doing.
Right.
And I think that's certainly true of this talk show, right? So I would certainly say you should continue doing this as long as you're enthusiastic about it. That's the first thing. The second thing is that, and this comes about a lot. I mean, I experienced this a lot when I was your age, and then in grad school, and then also as a younger faculty member. There is a set paths for doing certain things. Here is the common path for how you become an academic, or here is a common path for how you start your company and get acquired by someone else. And those are good standard backbone paths to follow, but every person is very unique, right? And I think part of everyone's journey, both of yours and mine individually, and this is a journey that continues for the rest of your life, is to bring out the unique aspects that are unique to you. And you can't just do this by sitting and staring at the ceiling and saying, okay, what's unique to me? That's not going to happen. It only happens by your actions and the projects that you do.
Right, by trying it out.
Exactly. You try out something, you're like, yeah, okay, that was great. And, maybe that worked for a couple of years. And after that, I kind of lost interest. Maybe, that's not kind of what I wanted to do. Or maybe, I've been doing this for 7 years, right? And it's great. But I think the important thing is to do things that you like doing and experiment with that a little bit. Not experiment too much, because you only have limited 24 hours in a day and 7 days in a week. But so that you bring out what's unique in you. They say this also about artists or singers. Right? You see them when you listen to some singers. I follow Bollywood music a lot, so I follow the path of singers. So some of the singers, they start out, they come into the limelight because their voice sounds like another very well-known singer who just passed away. And then they sound great, they're all in tune. And then over the years, you see them slowly like bringing out their own voice. And that's when their songs are really, really beautiful, right? It's like objectively beautiful to, even though I'm a subject, this is my subjective opinion, but like objectively also it's very different, it's unique.
Right.
That's where their own unique voice shines through, right? And I think the same is true of everyone, not just artists, but like engineers and everyone else, right? Even if you're in a company, even if you're working in a company, the same thing is true if you're a grad student, whether you're a researcher, there are always set paths to doing certain things. The set paths are always good fallback options, but the important thing is to figure out what is unique to you and strike a path that is kind of unique to you. Doesn't mean, going off and doing weird things like, designing one fine day or saying, okay, I need to strike my own path. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying be rebellious for no reason. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is don't get lost in the default paths that people imagine that others have for you. Because that way, when you look back on your life, whatever, 30, 40, 50 years from now, whenever you are, you'll say, okay, I kind of, I may have done some things different ways, but at least I lived my own life and not someone else's notion of what my life should have been. Right? So that's kind of the two things I would say about that.
Yeah, and that's how I see it. I mean, I think I see my time at college as a big experiment. Like you should do as many things, as many seemingly random things to use. So once you look back, you can connect similar things.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this is an experiment I've done. I created this Twitter bot that basically tells you like where to find free food on campus.
Oh, nice. Yeah,
and that thing
that's
is
very
like
useful. Yeah,
exploded. It has more than 200,000 impressions, and everyone knows about it.
Very nice.
So it's just like some seemingly random things that you can only connect by looking backwards, and you can see, okay, I like this thing about the talk show because of this aspect. I like this thing about this project because of this aspect. And then once you look back, everything just kind of makes sense.
Yeah, and big things start small, right? So there are a lot of stories of very successful companies and how they started. And many companies, Twitter, you mentioned Twitter. How did Twitter start? Twitter started when Jack Dorsey was creating an email list for his friends for events in the Bay Area. He was like, let me just create an email list. And pretty soon, like it became like a social network-y kind of thing, right? Twitter was not intended to be a social network in the beginning. We all know, how Facebook started, from the movie The Social Network. Flickr, which I don't know if it exists anymore, but photo tagging software. Mm-hmm. Flickr actually started as a game, not as a photo tagging software.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it started as a game called Game Never Ending. That's what that particular team was doing. This was like when they were a small startup company. And then, they had these players playing the game, and then over time they found that players would share photographs and they would tag each other in the photographs. They're like, oh, that's a nice thing. Maybe we can just spin that off and do that side project on the side. And pretty soon that thing really blew up, and that became the main thing that they were doing, right? So Flickr also started as not a photo sharing thing. So you start from somewhere, but then you move based on both your interests, but also based on what works and what people ask for, right? So, but you have to start somewhere, right? You can't just say, oh, I'm going to strike it rich with my very first idea. No one is a soothsayer for the matter, right? So pretty much every startup company started from a point which is not the same as when they actually reach success. Those 2 points, if you ask them at different points, they're very, very different. So going back to what you were saying, I think it's important to experiment. It's important to do these things. Because, when you look back at it, you're like, okay, that was great. I learned a lot of things through that, and that's what is helping me now to do this, right? So there's this, I love saying this quote. There's this quote, I think it's from Estonian. The quote goes something like this. It's a very short quote. It says, the work will teach you how to do it. That's it. That's the quote. The work will teach you how to do it. There are some things that have courses, like how do you program in C++, or how do you do distributed systems, which is a course I teach. And for other things, most things in life, there is no course. You just have to do it, and that's how you learn. How do you do research? There is no course. I could start a course, but the course would be woefully inadequate and it wouldn't be useful at all. So research is one of those things that once you do it, it teaches you how to do it. Part of that is also, as you're doing it, you realize what is unique about your style of doing research. Not just, the problems that you pick or whatever, but also like your actual workflow for doing research. Like, do you just like to go off and think for 2 weeks about an idea and come back and then bam, implement it? Or do you like to think by bouncing ideas off of others? Very different styles, right? The first style works for some people, second style works for other people, right? So part of that goal is also figuring out what really works for you, right? So that's part of also, the work teaching you how to do it as well. The same thing is true in the entrepreneurial world as well, right? Some people are great at just sitting down and building something, and it's like, okay, we have something here, right? Others, need to bounce ideas off of each other, and it's a teamwork, and so you have to figure out what is it that works for you. And it's not just this team versus individual. There are a lot of other subtle things about work lifestyles and being productive that you're not going to discover by just sitting and staring at a wall or sitting and staring at the ceiling, right? So that's part of also the work teaching you how to do it. And I think that's true of all work, whether it's research, whether it's entrepreneurial work, whether it's even working in a company, right? You go to a big company and you start, you're like, now what do I do? Literally, okay, do the following things to get oriented, and take the following code labs to get certified in the following languages, and then like, okay, then what, right? And as human beings, when we are children, how do we learn how to speak, or how do we learn how to walk? We imitate others, right? We imitate our parents, we imitate whoever is our guardian. The same thing is also true when you start in a company, also is true when you start in a research environment. You try to imitate like whoever seems to be the most productive around you. But that's not all we should be doing, right? At some point of time, you have to say, okay, I walk a slightly different way from my parent or my guardian. I talk a slightly different way from my parent or my guardian. And it's okay, because it's unique, right? And others also appreciate you for it. Just like your parent or your guardian appreciates the way you talk, they find it cute, appreciates the way you walk. They don't say, oh, why are you messing up certain words, you 2-year-old baby? No one says that, right? So I think that's also part of growing up and just realizing that one of the things that every human appreciates is also being in a safe environment where there is room for you to grow, and there is not like a lot of requirements for you, like nonstop, that you cannot grow.
And on this subject of learning and teaching, right? It has been more than 2 decades since you came to the US, right?
Yeah, 24 years. Yeah, 24 years. Yeah.
And like you've tried so many new things. Like even though you are a CS professor, right? But you've done music. You've had your own podcast, right? And you mentioned that it taught you a lot of things. And the fact that you mentioned that making a music video about the algorithm and how it was helping students learn it better, right? I want to ask you, like, how has trying all these artistic endeavors taught you how to be a better teacher and a better educator? Because right now we are following a system that has been set for like it precedes our age, right? It has been something that has been set in stone for a very long time, and we only keep tweaking it a little bit based on the society. And we're still following the same educational model and how we're still imparting education to the students. But knowing this and all these contextual experiences that you've had, how has that made you a better educator? Or what do you think needs to change?
I think you're right. That's a really good question. And you phrased it very beautifully as well. I think a lot of the default way of teaching, not just in universities, but also in schools and everywhere else, is a very one-way way of teaching. Sometimes it's unavoidable because the class is very large. But even if the class is very large, it doesn't need to be a one-way. It can be a more interactive style of learning. So I think it's very important for a teacher to be very accessible to their students, to his or her students, because I think you can teach techniques or you can teach whatever you happen to be teaching, but one of the things that students pick up on is just the enthusiasm of the teacher who's teaching it. Sometimes they actually say it, like explicitly. The student will tell me, sometimes many years later when they come back for like a career fair and they're a big honcho in their company, they'll come back and say, your enthusiasm, they've actually told me many times, your enthusiasm for the subject really, was infectious, right? Sometimes, a student's enthusiasm infects me. I'm like, oh, this person's so excited. Let's look at that. Let's look at distributed machine learning, right? That's how I got involved in that topic. So I think and this is kind of one of the things that we missed during the pandemic era, because if you're in the two-dimensional Zoom world, you cannot infect COVID over the Zoom, but you also cannot infect enthusiasm as effectively over Zoom. You have to be in person for infecting enthusiasm. So I think that's part of what is missed. And then the second thing is that I think just in the pedagogical style, how we teach things, whether it's in class or whether you're teaching a colleague the ropes, or whether you're teaching yourself. You're teaching yourself. You're the teacher. You're also the student. That's also, you have to be gentle with yourself, right? Or whether you're teaching a parent how to use a mobile device. I bought my mom an iPad. How do I teach her how to do this? She's much older than I am. She doesn't know how to use it. All of the experiences, I think it's very important to learn how to effectively kind of be in the moment, right? And not like always think of, okay, here is the end goal. Here is what I need to do by the end of lecture today, or here is what I would like to happen in the next 10 minutes. No, like just be in the moment, right? I think that's really, really important, right? So that's part of what, like, if your listeners and viewers who practice meditation, this is what meditation also teaches. Like being in the moment, being in the present moment is really, really important. Right? And I think that's true of teaching as well. It's certainly true of teaching technical topics, because I've experienced this and I've heard other colleagues here and elsewhere tell me this, that you're giving a lecture which you've given a gazillion times before, and then a student asks you a question and you go, I've never thought of that question. Or in the middle of a sentence, you're like, wait, that's not the real reason. And then afterwards you go off and think about it, and that leads to a new research project. That's part of why we teach, right? So not everything is set in stone, right? There's a particular way of building a building, but that's not the only way of building a building. There are many different ways. So you could be describing a way, and you might say, I don't know why these two joists fit this way. They could fit a slightly different way, right? Or I could be using different materials for it. So that's partly what also teaching teaches you, right? So I mentioned, teaching a parent an iPad, how to use a mobile device. I actually taught my mom a couple of years ago to use, just some very basic banking apps. She lives in India, so I taught her how to use basic banking apps. And as I'm doing that, I can feel like a little bit of impatience in me. It's like, why doesn't she get this? Like, I answered this question yesterday. Why did you get, so it's the same thing. But then as I'm doing that, I'm thinking, like I forget things oftentimes, like, stuff that I did, how do I remember it? She clearly doesn't have access to all of those, experiences. But also, I'm her, and I'm everyone else who has this experience. So I think empathizing more with students and what they're going through is also kind of part of the teacher's role. It's becoming harder now because in this country, certainly because certainly in school teachers are paid very little, and that makes it very hard for them to think of their job as something that they enjoy. Professors in universities are paid better, though we are still paid below the market rate, because just because we have tenure, so we are paid below the market rate, right? So any one of us faculty could go to industry and be paid significantly more than what we are paid here. So we are not here for the salary, for the money, right? But then again, even here in many of our classes, the class sizes are just growing so quickly that it's very hard to know everyone, right? So, when Socrates used to sit down with his students, he would be like, okay, here are my 5 students. I know every one of their names. I also know where they live, and I know kind of where the background is. But when that 5 becomes 500, I don't think Socrates could have remembered any one of their details, right? He may remember some of them. And that's not very democratic, right? So you want to be accessible to all of your students, no matter what their backgrounds and no matter what their level of learning is. So that's a challenge. I think that's a continuous challenge that all of us faculty face. We talk about it oftentimes. But it's certainly something that again, like what I was saying earlier, I could not have predicted that, this is what I would be saying about teaching when I first started in this job, like 18, 19 years ago. But it's something that I just learned by teaching these different classes over the years.
So what would you change?
What would I change? You mean about how I used to teach classes earlier?
Or just like today as a
Yeah.
teacher,
Yeah.
what needs to change?
That's a hard question. I think there are many different answers. I think a very important thing is to get more people into college, whether it's universities or whether it's community colleges. I think certainly in this country, the appreciation for university education has taken a downturn, partly because of political reasons, but also partly because certain venture capitalists, who I will not mention here, have been going around saying, hey, you can be a high school dropout and be a billionaire. That's fine. You don't need these professors teaching you, left-wing stuff or whatever. You're not very left-wing. I'm pretty centrist. So it's partly that. I think that messaging is impacting how many people choose to come to university or how many people choose to go to vocational school. Like if you want to become an electrician, you don't need to get an electrical engineering degree in Illinois. You can go to a community college like Parkland College here, get a perfectly fine vocational degree, and you'll be fine. You will be a certified electrician. You'll be and you can go about doing your activities. But even that, I think there is a certain feeling in this country of, I don't need that. I can be an expert, by watching social media comments or whatever, right?
Watching YouTube.
Watching YouTube or maybe not even that, we have had a lot of armchair experts in the last couple of years who know a lot more about pandemics and diseases than experts, right? Just by listening to comments in social media. And so I think the value of education comes from not just the content of the classes that are being taught, but also from being there with people, with the fellow students, and learning from them as well. This is certainly true of me. When I was in college, what I learned in college, half of it was from my teachers, half of it was from my fellow students. Right? Just by observing them, like, okay, what is that person doing that I'm not doing? Or, oh, that person has this very nice technique. My friend might ask me, oh, how did you cover this particular topic? I'm like, okay, this is how I did it. I'm like, oh, that's very intuitive. So I learned a lot more from just talking and observing them. I think that's the part of the education that gets missed when, in the media, people talk about universities, they're filled with these certainly professors and they're turning all our kids into left-wing zealots. That's certainly not true. We are not political at all here, certainly not in my department, computer science. So I think part of it, I think that's something that needs to change, is the appreciation for a college degree or a community college degree. In terms of teaching, I think there is a high variability in how different teachers teach, right? And that's just what it is. Different people teach differently. Some people actually don't like teaching, and they should not be a faculty member.
Right.
That's one of the things about the tenure system that you get, right? So once you get tenure, they can't really fire you unless you have an ethical violation or something. You can have pretty low teaching scores and they can give you a warning or so, but I don't know what the rules are on firing a really bad teacher. This is something that does get talked about in the media, about school teachers, but also about university faculty. I would say that's it's true, but most of us who are teaching, a large majority of us who are teaching, are really enthusiastic about the topic. And we have, it's certainly not like we don't like teaching and we are here, gritting our teeth. That's certainly not true. That's definitely not true of pretty much all the colleagues that I talk with. Right? So I think just the awareness of that. And then the third thing, and this was actually told to me by one of my podcast guests. She told me that we as faculty, as professors, we don't communicate to our students how exciting it is to be a professor. Right? So students see our life, undergrads, when they see our life, they're like, okay, professor came to class, taught, and then went back. What does a professor do the remaining,
Yeah, that's it.
like whatever, 100 hours of the week, right? That's the undergrad view. The grad student's view is like, I see my advisor constantly running around and they're constantly in meetings, one meeting to another. When I email them, they're like, oh, I'm busy with the proposal today, I can't respond, can we talk tomorrow? When do they get time for the rest of their life? Are they really enjoying this life? Like, very different views, right? And I think about my own life. I'm like, no, I have enough time to do teaching. I set aside time to do research. I talk with my PhD students. I have a nice diverse group of 5 or 6 PhD students. And then I do my own music thing. I do my radio show. I can do my podcast. So I can do all of these things as long as I plan my life well. And it's fun. And even the teaching part of it, I enjoy that. The part that some students think is, like not sexy. I actually enjoy that a lot because it teaches me. And I love interacting with students because, they ask awesome questions, and some questions make me think. Other questions make me think about how I think about something that I know, and it changes perspective. I think that's something that we faculty are not good at communicating because I think a lot of us just enjoy our job so much, right, that we never get to talk about it, how exciting it is, just to be a professor. I would not give up anything. I would not, we were talking about this earlier, right? So at any point of time in my life, I'm always thinking, should I stay a faculty member? Should I go to a big company instead? Just drop everything and just go to a big company? Or should I start up my own company? All options are available. Or maybe something else. Should I just abandon computing and become a full-time professional musician or do whatever, right? All those options are there. To me, the option that always sounds the most exciting and has so far, now this may change tomorrow, the most exciting option is being a professor, right? It's the profession that gives me the most satisfaction, interacting with students, interacting with my fellow colleagues, also interacting with people in industry who are building systems. So I am where I want to be at every point of time. But again, that's not something we communicate to students all the time. So it doesn't get captured in all the stereotypes that exist about professor life. There's a lot of very nice cartoons, for instance. You've probably seen XKCD and PhD comics and all these other cartoons that exist. And some of them are true. I love all those. I love all of those comics. But then there are some stereotypes out there about professors as well, which are not true. So I think that's something that I think faculty need to be doing more of, communicating the excitement behind.
I think one thing I need to thank you for is for not using Canvas and having your website in a way that is also not password protected, in the sense that, if I want to see your slides, you can just click on link and do that. That's something that it's important, because even computer science professors are also using Canvas for some reason sometimes. So that's nice that you're still using your own website. And not using anything restricted.
I'm a big fan of opening all course material to everyone, not just the slides but also videos. The university doesn't like me saying the second part, the videos part. But I've had the on-campus version of the course I have. I also have an online version which runs on Coursera. And it has run on Coursera since 2015. It's had a few 100,000 students who have taken the course. Most of those students, online students, are professionals at companies who are taking this course on the side. And you can access, I believe you can access the Coursera videos without paying a fee. So they're free. But there are also pirated versions of my lectures, which someone posted on YouTube for free. And I think either my colleague or someone else from the company came and told me, should we file a DMCA takedown notice? I'm like, nope, please do not do that. Let it stay on YouTube. I want it to be out there. Free versions are good. Let it stay out there, because everyone needs to have access to that. And people actually watch. Sometimes someone will watch it and say, I took your course, I saw a video or something.
And they went there.
Yeah. Now, since I started the Coursera course, anytime I visit a company, some random company, if I spend at least a few hours at the company, at least one of the following kind of incident will happen. I'm walking down the corridor with my host from one meeting to another. A random person walks up to me and says, "Can I take a selfie with you? I watched your Coursera video lectures." This happens so many times now. And sometimes it's just a selfie. Sometimes I actually keep in touch with them afterwards. So I'm a big fan of opening all.
I want to ask you about the college question.
Yeah.
So I think the political thing, I think you may need to walk a little south of campus. I think that the story is a little different.
Yeah.
But I do want to ask you about the college thing, about especially for computer science. Of course, you have a different story. You follow the path in the sense of, you went to grad school, you went to undergrad, and you follow all the right steps, perhaps.
Yeah.
But there's also the sense of there's this notion that if you don't go to college, you'll end up in in the streets or something. That it's either college is good. If you don't go to college, you end up in a bad place. And I think you are also in an exception in a field like computer science, because it's one of the few fields that have demand, in the sense of even in engineering, right? Like everyone, students at least, everyone in engineering, they think in engineering, thing you do is good because you'll be famous, rich, and happy, which is far from the truth because a lot of the engineering jobs, the demand, it just isn't there. Computer science is different because, as you've seen, software and everything has been growing, and there's a huge demand for it.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the few fields where you can go and get an education and still you can get it's a good investment in the sense of if you want to think of college that way.
Yeah.
But there's also the notion of, for computer science, which is a field that, like for the type of things that, let's say, like we've seen a lot of things that have come out, like computer science companies and a lot of things.
Yep.
And a lot of those people do not attend college.
Yep.
Even a lot of them, they say that people I know and everything is that they seem to have a different perspective. Like there's some people who say that you become a good coder before college or after college, never during college. So
It's true. Yep.
So from your perspective, I mean,
Yep.
you've worked in industry, you worked at Google one year,
Yeah.
and obviously you have a lot of experience, 20 years in this area. Like, how much do you think that's true? Because it's definitely no black and white. It's
Yeah.
not one or the other.
Yeah.
How do you think of that question? Like, what do
Yeah.
you? It's a complicated thing. But.
Yeah, there is no causality that says if you go to college, you will be successful. There is no causality that says if you do not go to college, you will not be successful. I believe there is some correlation between going to college and having a good backup option. I'm a big fan of doing something that I'm excited about, but always having a plan B in case that thing doesn't work out. Either I don't stay enthusiastic about it, or maybe it was just not the right time for it. Maybe I'm 10 years too early for it, right? So if you don't go to college or vocational school and you don't have any skills and you try a startup and it doesn't work, at some point of time, it's too late. Well, I don't want to say it's too late because a lot of students take courses at advanced stages of their life. But like the physical energy and mental energy and enthusiasm that you have in your 20s is not the same that you have in your 30s, and it's not the same that you have in your 40s and 50s. It is different. After all, it's a human body, right? Even though sometimes, there are always exceptions to everything, right? I think the 20s and maybe the early 30s are the most productive times of your life. And that's when you're kind of building the base for the rest of your life. And so I'm a big fan of preparing always for a plan B option, so that there's always a backup fallback option. You can say, okay, that startup didn't work out, and maybe I go work in a big company for a couple of years, and then maybe I try a new startup. That's in the engineering world, right? Also in like South of Green Street, if you're talking of people in literature or like Russian literature or Slavic literature, I have friends who actually studied those. Again, even there, where it's much harder to find jobs, like it's not like you have a gazillion faculty positions. There may be like a few fingerful of faculty positions in the entire country in a particular area, like Russian literature. There too, I think it's important to think about, what is my plan B option? Like, what's my fallback option? Yes, I want to become a faculty member, but if I don't, then what am I going to do? I can't just sit at home. That's not valuable, right? So I think a college degree or college education, whether it's university or whether it's a 2-year community college, really helps you build a foundation during the years that you can build that foundation, right? And then you can do whatever you want afterwards, but you always have a fallback option, right? So you always have a cushion to fall back on. Sometimes you hear of sport. I'm going to talk about sports because I love sports as well. A lot of like if you look at National Football League, NFL, a lot of college players want to be NFL players. Not a surprise, big surprise, right? Not all of them become NFL players. There's only like 30 odd NFL teams, and every one of them has only a few tens of players who make it there. And so not every single college football player makes it into the NFL draft, and they don't make it. And then if they didn't have the college degree, then they have no skills. or they have very few skills to fall back on. Some of them do, some of them have other skills, right? But if you have a college degree, then you can go off and do something else, right? Maybe you have a college degree in just like kinesiology and you become a trainer for a sports team. That's great, fantastic. You have a fallback option, right? Or you have a college degree. We had a basketball player in our 2005 in a basketball team who was, I think, an ECE, electrical engineering major. He used to come into class and he would take all the exams. Sometimes he would take conflict exam because they would have games. But he was working towards his degree, right? So that was very, very important. So it's the same thing, even if you're not a sports person, right? That you always want to have a fallback option, right? So I think that's very important for people to think about, whether you're a sports person or not, whether you're engineering or south of Green Street. Fallback options are very useful to think about.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because a lot of people see college as that way as a fallback option, but some may argue that your college years are some of the most productive times of your life, and being here you may see it as non-risky, but there's also a lot of
it's
risk.
A waste of 4 years in just sitting in college, sitting in classes.
A lot of risk in that sense, and there's also if you see college as an insurance, what are you what are you expecting? It's like. You don't buy insurance when you think something's going to go well. You buy insurance because there's a risk of something bad happening.
Right.
So it's what does that say about our society in that sense?
Yeah, but also I think I don't look at it only as insurance, and I don't think many students do either. It's also that as you go through college, you discover new things about yourself, right? So part of what everyone is doing, whether they're starting a company, whether they're doing their own project on the side, some people do podcasts for profit, for instance. That's also a career, right? It's a very hard career. It's really, really hard. Part of all of that is discovering yourself, what you like and what you're good at. That's also what college is about, right? That's really what you're discovering through the college years. It's not like, okay, you go in, wham, bam, you get a degree in 4 years and you're done. You're like, okay, that chapter of my life is closed. No, you learned a lot of things along the way in those 4 years. You made a lot of friends. Maybe you found a spouse and got married later. Whatever, a lot of things happen in life as well, right? Maybe you made friends for life. I still am in contact with people I made friends with in college years. And some of them work in my field, some of them don't, and those are like lifelong friends, right? So there are a lot of these intangibles, like they say in sports, things that you don't really think about when you're thinking about college, but they become the real thing, right? So for instance, just to explain the intangibles comment a little bit more, when a sports team is evaluating, let's say, a quarterback, right? They're like, oh, the quarterback throws very accurately. The quarterback runs very fast. Quarterback is built very well, whatever, they have a great pedigree. And then they're like, okay, but, there are these 10 other quarterbacks with similar characteristics. Why are we getting this guy? And usually the reason is this person is a good team player. They motivate others to do well. In the locker room, they might have a small comment that they say to a struggling teammate that causes that struggling teammate to do better the next time. It's these small intangibles that elevate one player over another, right? They actually talk about this when sports commentators talk about players, whether it's NFL or the Major League Baseball, they actually talk about the intangibles. And so it's these anything has foreground main advantages and then it has intangible advantages. And sometimes intangible advantages are known, like you're going to make friends in college, obviously. Sometimes the intangible advantages are not known at all. For instance, you guys doing this talk show, it's not everyone does a talk show. Not every student does a talk show, right? So it's a very unique intangible and it's something that is adding to your skill set and is adding to your experiences, and that will, no matter what you end up doing in your future life, like 10, 20 years from now, will certainly influence everything you do and how you interact with people, right? So it's these intangibles that don't get talked about college as well. So it's an experience, I think.
Yeah. Is there something that you wish you would have done differently?
That's my one of my common questions in my podcast. You mean in my life or yeah? Oh, regrets. I have a lot of regrets. I don't even know where to start. A lot of things differently. I think advising students when they're doing research is a challenge that all professors deal with. And when we start out as junior faculty, assistant professors, we just have no clue. of how to advise students, right? We go through grad school when we're doing our PhDs. We go through grad school, learning how to do research, learning how to code, and whatever else. This is true not just in engineering; it's true of like across. Even in South Campus, you talk to them, they'll be like, "I did research, and then the day I become a faculty member, boom, I have 5 students. What do I do with these 5 students? Like suddenly I jumped over the other side of the fence, and I have no skills. It's unfortunate. I mean, no university does a good job of teaching their grad students how to be good faculty members. There is no like sequence of courses that teaches you this. It just doesn't exist at all. It's very unfortunate. And actually, we faculty talk about it a lot, right? And I hear every year we have new faculty joining us, and every year I hear the same thing from the new faculty. It's like, I'm in the middle of the swimming pool. How do I do this? How do I do that? Right? So there's always like things you learn cause regrets. Things I wish I had done this way differently. It's never like I'm not an aggressive personality, so I don't interact negatively with people. But it's always there's subtle ways in which you can say the same message, right? So there's a lot. There is learning always leads to regrets, right? So there's that. I certainly feel that I wish I had picked up done more musically earlier in my life. I think it's only later in life that I started to appreciate how much I really enjoy music. Earlier, like when I was a kid, I grew up in India and in the 80s and 90s, and my dad, he used to play a couple of instruments. He used to play the sitar, which is a string instrument, and he also used to play the tabla, which is a percussion instrument. So my dad had a sitar, and I used to like doodle around with that. And he's like, "We'll get you a teacher." And so he got me a teacher who would come in like once a week. And fortunately, the school that I was going to also had actually music class and music teacher there. So I learned a little bit of sitar there. And then after that, when I was in undergrad, I kind of, I had my keyboard, like piano type keyboard. I would play that, but I really didn't pay attention much. I tried to pick up the flute, tried to pick up the mouth organ, but like life was so busy that I didn't have time to invest there. And then just 10, 15 years went by and I didn't pick up any new instruments. And only recently, like 2017 or so, is when I got a ukulele. And when I bought the ukulele, I had zero idea how to play it. The story of that is also very interesting, which I can tell you some other time. The story of how I got the ukulele is also very interesting. But I had no clue, but I enjoyed the process so much afterwards. I was like, man, I should have done more of this earlier. It would have just made my whole life so much more enjoyable, right? And it would have led to more enjoyment for my students because they also enjoy this part as well.
Yeah, people say that you regret the thing that you didn't do more than the things that you did.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. That's true.
Very true.
But how would you actually have done it? Because you wish you did it, but if you did, you wouldn't have done as well in your classes. For I don't know, perhaps
in research.
So how you have done that?
I think it's doable. In hindsight, I think it's doable. Look, so I when I think about it, for myself, I started doing my radio show, which I mentioned at WEFT 90.1 FM. I started doing it in 2005 when I was 3 years an assistant professor, and I did not have tenure then. And sometimes people don't believe me when I say this. That I started a radio show when I had not yet gotten tenure. They're like, "You're crazy." I'm like, "What did you do that?" But I actually did that. If I had time to do that, and I had time to actually participate in volunteer activities in that radio station, in the group there, I would have had time to do other things too. So I think the lack of time was probably not a good enough reason for me not to have done that. I would have probably had to be more smarter about my time. Maybe I would not have been. Maybe I would have spread myself too thin and I would have given up on it. But I think the regret I have is not trying it. I don't think I ever picked up a new instrument between 2003 and 2017. I don't think I picked up any new ones. I continued playing the things that I had, like the keyboard, and I would go back to the flute occasionally, but I didn't pick up any new ones. So that's the regret. I think I could have done it.
What's a conversation or an incident that you keep coming back to, or that gets you motivated, or maybe just inspires you in some way?
It's always, I think it's my dad. So my dad was an engineer, he was a mechanical engineer.
Like him.
Yeah, exactly, like you, yes. And he used to work in an Indian company, one of the public firms there that used to make televisions.
Which one?
ECTV,
EC.
Electronic Corporation of India Limited. That's where my dad used to work. But he was not in the team that made television. He was in the team that made antennas.
Okay.
Like these dish antennas,
Right,
huge
right.
antennas, right? So later on in his life, like close to his retirement, he was actually involved in India's moon mission, Chandrayaan. His team was actually involved in building the dish antennas and things for the thing itself, which he used to be very excited. He would come home and talk about it. So he had a very scientific mind. And very early on, when I was in school, like 5th grade, 6th grade, he once sat me down and he said, I'm going to tell you one thing which is going to be very useful for you, which is planning. You got to plan everything and plan backwards. What is your deadline? Plan backwards from it until today, right? So I used to do this exercise before, like literally every exam in school. Initially, my dad would help me through it, but after a while, I just like automatically start doing it myself. And say, okay, I have a history exam on Monday, geography exam on Wednesday, English exam on Friday. Okay, here's what I'm going to do. Be studying every hour of the week, starting from Saturday before, right? Not 24 hours of the day, but like whatever, 7 a.m., 6 a.m. or whenever I would wake up until 9 p.m. whenever I would. And I think that planning is really important. Clearly, it was very useful for me in school, but even now, I think planning is useful when you're trying to meet a deadline for a paper submission, or trying to meet a deadline for a homework submission or a programming assignment submission. And so I would say I always keep coming back to that conversation, and also what my dad taught me about about planning in the subsequent conversations until I became an independent planner. The other thing, which is also the subtle thing about planning, which sometimes when I talk about planning, people are like, oh, okay, whatever. People don't get, is when you make a plan, you need to be gentle on yourself. You always need to acknowledge that every plan will always overflow. You make a plan for, okay, I need 2 hours to do this, it will take 3 hours. So build in buffer time. You say, okay, 2 hours for this, 2 hours for this, buffer time of 1 hour for something to overflow. Maybe the first one will overflow, maybe the second one will overflow. I don't know which one. And then, something else for 3 hours or whatever. Build in enough buffer times. If you finish that in time, well, you have an extra hour free. Fantastic. Otherwise, you have some time to overflow, and the next thing doesn't get shifted in a sense, right? So that, I think, is very important. It's something that I try to communicate to students. Some of them do it better than others, but it's something certainly that sticks with me. I still remember my dad would sit down and do planning with me before some exams when I was in 5th grade, and then sometime in the middle of 6th grade, he once came into my room as I was studying, and he was like, okay, let's sit down and do the plan. And I had the plan up on the wall. He's like, wow, okay, my job is done. He just went out and he said, okay, I'm never going to come back and talk to you about planning. That's it. That was the last conversation I had with him about planning, ever, like ever. He never talked to me about planning ever after that. He's like, you got it. That's it.
I used to do that a lot too, like during exam seasons. I would, if I have like 2 weeks left before this exam start, I would plan out, okay, these days I'll be studying this subject. And then you make smaller deadlines. And
So that's very useful. The flip side of planning is that you can become very obsessive about planning.
Exactly.
Right?
That's the bad.
That's the really bad side. So I think it's important, again, to continue to be gentle on yourself and everyone else around you too, whether it's your friends or family or whatever. I still remember once where it was the day before, this was again in school, actually it was in high school, the day before a very important exam, and one of my childhood friends just happened to visit with his dad. And I was furious. I was like, I had this plan for this day of what to study when, and this person just comes in and burns 4 hours of my time. And I was staring there, glaring at him. And afterwards they had left and the exam got done. It was fine. The exam was okay. Afterwards, I felt so bad for having felt so bad. It's like I did not enjoy the 3 hours of that time where my childhood friend was sitting in front of me and like I couldn't talk to him properly. And this was one of the few times that they had visited my house. We were talking about regrets, right? So this is again another one of my minor regrets. But that's the flip side of planning. They can get really obsessive about it, right? You can say, oh, my buffers are getting burned. I'm sitting here, like I had a 1 hour buffer, and now it's already 1 hour since my friend has been here. Right? I still remember counting that in my mind. But that was me being not gentle on myself and not also realizing, maybe because I was immature, not realizing the value of the time that I was spending with that person, right? At the end of the day, that's at the end of the day, I don't remember that exam, but I remember this conversation.
Exactly.
Right? And the thinking in my mind. So I think that's the flip side of planning. So I think it's important to plan, but not plan too obsessively. Yeah, not over plan, and be gentle on yourself. I think that's really, really important.
Yeah, it's like failing to plan is planning to fail. And
that's very well put.
I think I didn't say it. I think it was Benjamin Franklin. But
nice.
No, I think that's like one of the differences that could make you like stand out from people.
Yeah.
Like since very early in high school, I read this book.
Yeah.
And basically just like planning. So for years, about 6 years, 7 years maybe, I have papers and papers just every week, every hour of planning. And even now I switched to digital. But it just that's one thing, because if I need to do something, I just do it. I don't need to think about doing the thing. I think that's one thing I've realized, that people spend a lot of time thinking about what to do and not doing enough.
Right.
And how much can you think about what to do? But it actually becomes hours.
Yeah. Yeah.
And throughout the years, it can become days and weeks and months.
Yeah. No, it's very good that you plan. There are some things you cannot plan for, like writing, right? Sometimes, researchers, faculty, and grad students, a lot of what we do is actually not just the science and the experiments, but writing and communicating what we have done, the importance of the problem, the novelty of the solution, why we did particular experiments, what do they show, and communicating that in a coherent, logical, and a story-like way is really important. And, fiction writers talk about facing a writer's block. Okay, I sat down to write my book and now I don't know where to start. Sometimes researchers also face a writer's block. You just sit down and you're like, I don't know where to start. A lot of people talk about this on like social media. I need to write my thesis. I don't know where to start, right? You can't really plan for that, right? For that, you just have to take it one step at a time. You say, okay, let me write the first sentence. It's going to be a crappy sentence, but I'm going to write it anyway. Then let me write the next sentence. Then when I've written one page, I'm going to go back and read it. And it's going to be crappy, and maybe I'll just delete all of it and rewrite it again. But that's progress. So there are some things you can plan, other things that you cannot plan. And it's sometimes impossible to know the difference between the two, but as you do more, you'll know more about the difference between the two.
So that's how your dad impacted you with planning and all these things. How did your mom had an impact in your life?
So my mom and then my sister, who is younger, they had a lot of impact on my life too. My mom was, she's actually, my dad passed away a few years ago. My mom is still alive. She lives in India. My mom is actually a classically trained dancer. She dances, she went through, her college in India was a Kathak dancing school. So she actually has a certificate from a college that says this person is a professional Kathak dancer. But then, after she got married and after I was born, she kind of gave up that. And that was very, very typical for that time in India and also many parts of the world. Women, once they got married, they were like, okay, that's the end of it. And I've had many conversations with my mom, not when I was a child, but like more recently, like, why did you give up that career? Why did you not continue it? And she goes, like, you were born and your sister was born and who's going to raise you? Like, no, you could have done that too. Of course, like, I'm being idealistic because I'm thinking 2000s and she was living 1970s and 1980s and 1990s, very different world. But part of that actually, part of those conversations with my mom and part of me seeing her sacrifice that is the reason why I think about women in computing and women in general in engineering and women actually making a career out of what they do. Matter of fact, one of the recent episodes I released on the podcast is called Pregnancy and Career. And there I featured the interviews with two women, one an entrepreneur and one an academic, both of whom had kids very early in their careers and how they navigated that. I think the setup now is, at least here in North America, it's that you can navigate that now better than you could have in the 1970s, right? And they have some very unique observations. Like this is not something that I would have thought of. For instance, the entrepreneur person that I interviewed, she says, I knew that when I went and told my venture capitalists that I was expecting, they would panic. That's the first thing that would happen. They would panic, right? They would think, oh, now this person is going to be offline for 9 months, a year and a half. This company is going to go down the drain. Let me pull my funding out. So her approach was the meeting that she went in to communicate the planning, to communicate that she was expecting, she also went in with a plan. She said, here's what is going to happen the next year and a half. On a week-by-week basis, here's what's going to happen. And she said there was no panic. When I explained what was going to happen, the unreliability, the unpredictability was reduced, and there was no panic, right? So I think, and again, that's not a skill that is necessarily taught again in our classes. I don't know any class here that teaches that kind of, how do you navigate expecting, for women. But sometimes it may also be true for men who are taking care of, if you're a single parent, for instance, how do you navigate that and also having a professional life? But I think it's, coming back to your question, I think conversations with my mom make me think a lot more about those issues that women still continue to face today. Even if you don't have a family, even if you're not expecting, you still face a lot of bias issues. If you're a woman, if you have a colored skin, if you're African American, if you're Native American, if you're Hispanic, you face a lot of biases. You face biases from people who may not be racist even, but it's just biases, right? For instance, there are well-known. There are studies that say that you guys, when you take a class, you rate the teacher at the end of the class, right? The ISIS ratings we have. There are actually studies that say that if you're a taller professor, you get higher ratings, all else being equal.
Really?
Yeah. If you're a male professor, you get higher ratings, all else being equal. There's biases built in people's minds, and this is, it's not going to go away anytime soon. So people face biases even if they're like not pregnant or not having a family. Those, make it even worse. And so, I think just understanding that is step one, right? So I think that's the long answer to your question.
And perhaps creating a class called "How to Raise VC Money While Pregnant." That would be
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, yeah. And she's this particular guest was very good. The other thing I learned from my mom is, and I did not think about this aspect that I learned from my mom until actually my PhD. I'd taken my parents to my alma mater. I did my PhD from Cornell University. So, well, after I graduated, I took my parents back to visit my alma mater, and one of the things I did there is just have breakfast with my PhD advisor and also my parents. The only time my parents met my PhD advisor. Later, my PhD advisor told me, your mom is very curious. She has very curious eyes, and she asks a lot of curious questions. And I thought, well, that is actually true. I had never thought about it in my life, but I guess that's where my kind of curiosity mostly comes from. Like my dad is curious, but not like that curious. My mom is curious to the extent that, she will pick up a language just by talking to people, on the street. Like she knows more languages than me or my sister, or certainly my dad. Also, she grew up in different parts of the country, like West Bengal, Kashmir. So she knows how to speak Kashmiri. She also knows how to speak Bengali. And then we grew up in Telangana. So my mom knows fluent Telugu. I'm kind of okay, broken in Telugu. I'm okay. But my mom, she never took a class in her life learning Telugu, but her Telugu is fluent, which is by talking to people, right? So just that curiosity and being okay in making mistakes. It's okay to make mistakes. You say a sentence, it's half grammatically incorrect, it's fine. The person got my intent. If you want to give me feedback, it'll improve me. But otherwise, my purpose was served. So that fearlessness and that courage and the curiosity, that combination, it's something that I never thought about it consciously until my advisor told me about it. But I think I just absorbed that through osmosis, like a lot of kids do from our parents, right? So lessons from my dad were a lot more consciously. I'm sure there are a lot of osmosis, things I learned through osmosis from my dad, through which I don't yet know about, because I haven't really thought about it. A lot from my mom. I think a lot of my lessons were learned through just osmosis, subconscious lessons.
Is your sister also in the U.S. or?
Yeah, my sister lives in Canada. She works in a financial firm there. She has an engineering and math degree, but she chose to move into the financial world. Yeah, so she works there. Her husband works there. She has 2 kids, and the kids adore me. I adore them. You know, they're fantastic. They're very smart as well. My sister's elder kid, who's a daughter, she's musically gifted. I tested her a couple of weeks ago. I suspected that she had perfect pitch, which is when you play a note, I should say. I tested her on like 40 different notes. She was able to identify every one of them.
Really?
Then I started playing chords. She was like, that's a C major, that's an F minor, that's a... She couldn't identify like 7th chords because she had not learned 7th chords. But I was like blown away. I was like, you know, this 7-8-year-old kid is like, whoa.
I wonder who she got it from.
Yeah, there's some, my dad used to sing. There's some musical talent in the family. My dad used to sing, and there's some other there. But, you know, every person is unique. I think there is some genetics playing, but, you know, every person is very, very unique. So my sister is around as well. It's nice having family somewhat nearby. You know, they live in Canada, which is not very far away. But this is something that, you know, immigrants deal with a lot of the time. You know, that I'm here, my sister is here, but my mom lives in India. Anytime my mom falls sick because she's old, you know, one of us has to go back there and take care of her in some way, shape, or form. This is something that a lot of my immigrant guests on my Immigrant Computer Scientists podcast brought up. Sometimes
like family back in
their country where they grew up. I initially, you know, when I had my initial list of default interview questions, this was not one of my questions. But in my very first interview, at the very end, I asked my guest, is there anything else you want to talk about which we haven't talked about? And she said, I thought you would ask about our parents who are left in our home country. I'm like, yeah, let's talk about that. And so that's where I kind of included that question, even though I don't ask it all the time consistently. But nearly everyone I talk to talks in some way, shape, or form about family that they left back in their home country. Usually it's parents, sometimes it's siblings also, and sometimes it's someone else, like grandparents or things like that. And you know, it's some people have their parents or grandparents move here to this country. You know, they immigrate through a green card and then become a U.S. citizen. But it's hard to do. You know, when you have grown up and spent a large part of your life in a country for whatever 60, 70 years, and then someone says, okay, you know, move to a completely different land. It's like uprooting all the social network connections and all the roots that you have laid down there. And it's sometimes people just don't want to do that, right? So that makes it challenging for them to move, but then it makes it hard for us immigrants here as well, right? Plus, there's issues with bringing parents here and the high cost of medical care here. You know, all of that stuff plays, and so.
Yeah, especially the elderly. It is, you know, it's hard for, you know, we're both from different places. I'm from Venezuela, and so we were able to bring my grandma. So my grandma and my great grandma. My great grandma is 92. Just had it.
Wow.
My grandma's about almost 70, and yeah, even though she's happy and everything, you know, especially after, you know, he's basically, we're all here in that sense. But it still is very hard for her in the sense of you know, the language, family, friends, and especially at that age where you're thinking about, like, you know, being with friends and just thinking about the, you know, it's just different. Having to think about, you know, I don't know the language. I don't feel like it's not necessarily imposter syndrome, but it's some different sort of a thing where you're here, but you're like, you don't feel completely here. And it's just a really hard thing, especially for people that age. Because, you know, you're young and, you know, you distract yourself with projects and things and whatever. You don't think much about these things. But for them, it's not something you can not think about.
And culturally also, it's very different here than most other countries. Like Venezuela and India, certainly, like it's very typical to just go knock on your neighbor's door and ask for sugar or milk, or just go there and just sit for like half an hour and talk. Here, you wouldn't do that.
It's like very formalized here.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I guess in some parts of the U.S. they do it, like, but not as much as, you know, like in most other countries. So that's certainly something that every time my mom comes here, she's come here enough times. She visits me enough often. She's been here enough times that she kind of knows the U.S. way of life. She's like, this is so weird, like you guys, like I cannot go and knock on it. She'd say to me, let's go just like knock on your neighbor's door and talk to them. Like, Mom, we don't like do that here. Like, but I see them on the street and you talk to them on the street. Why can't we just like go there or invite them over? I'm like, we could do that, but it has to be a bit more formalized, like you say. It's just very different, and I think that makes it a little bit harder.
Yeah, we same thing. So in his apartment, it's just like a bunch of people. It's like I don't know, like maybe 60 people on the floor, and just what is this? I mean, 60 people, 60 things you can learn, stories and things. So one day we had some time, we just started knocking on the door. And you'd be surprised. A lot of people didn't knock. Somewhere weird. They didn't like, oh, what? Do you want something? And then, but there are always people who are like, oh, what's up? Yeah, I'd love to talk to you.
Yeah.
And it's kind of breaking because it just seems like where you live, for some reason, is a very cultural thing where you're just there and you just like a box and you just like close yourself there and like you don't talk to anyone.
Yeah. And this also brings me to another thing which I observed many years ago in myself, but certainly observed during the podcast and this is true of immigrants. I read this first in a book by a very well-known therapist, Alan Rowland, who wrote this book about his patients anonymously, but all of his patients were immigrants, like mostly Asians, Indians, mix of them. So he had this observation, which I read, and I was like, this is not true. But then over the years, I've seen enough evidence, including my own life. The observation is the following. You grow up in a country, and you leave it, let's say, you immigrate to US or wherever else in some year. Let's say you left it. What year did you leave Venezuela?
13, 14.
13, 14, okay. So, and I left like India in 1998, right? Your picture of your home country is time-stamped the year that you left it. That is never going to change. It is never going to move forward or backwards. In the meantime, your country has moved on, has advanced, changed in fairly different ways. Every time you go back, you're going to be like, oh man, this country is so different now than it was when I remember it. And when you remember it as the year you left it, that is never going to change, right? So I read this many years ago when I was in grad school. I was like, that's not true. And then in the mid-2000s, I went to India like every 1 or 2 years. And every time I went back, I would get a culture shock. I would get a reverse culture shock. I thought I would get a culture shock when I go to the US, which I did. But I'm going to India and I'm like, okay, I'm getting a culture shock. One of the culture shocks was sometime in the early 2000s, I went back to India and I didn't have a cell phone. Like I think cell phones were just coming around here. I went back, I'm like observing everyone has a cell phone. I buy mangoes from a very poor person selling mangoes in a cart on the street. The person has torn shirt and a torn dhoti, and they fish out a phone from their pocket. I'm like, dude, this guy has a phone. I don't have a phone. How is this like possible? Right? That was a huge culture shock for me. But even since then, a lot of things have given me a culture shock. And this is true of immigrants no matter when you left. This is a very pan-immigrant phenomenon. It doesn't matter which country you left for which other country. It doesn't really matter. Your viewpoint of your home country is time-stamped the year that you left it, which also means that a lot of immigrants who have been in the US for many years are actually a lot more conservative and traditional than pretty much anyone else from that origin country, including the people who actually live in that origin country. Right? So sometimes you'll hear in the news, oh, these people, they're they're immigrants, but they live in the US, they've lived there for so many years. Why they're displaying these behaviors that are so backwards behaviors? It's because, they're time-stamped in the 70s when they left their home country. That's the India that they still live in their minds, right? That's why, their kids don't want to tell them that they are living with their girlfriend or boyfriend. They only will tell them when they get married, right? But there's time-stamped in 1970s. But if you live in India now, like living in with your partners, it's fine, it's normal. Wasn't normal in 1990s. I remember having this conversation with my mom. I was like, Mom, what do you think of living relationships? And I think it was in the 1990s. She was like, ooh, that doesn't sound right. And then sometime in the late 2000s, I think Mom and I were watching some series on Netflix or something like that where there was a live-in relationship. I'm like, Mom, what do you think of that? She's like, yeah, that's pretty normal. I'm like, well, 15 years, like what changed? She's like, I don't know. It's normal now, right? And in my mind, like I'm stuck thinking, Mom is like that, right? So it's just very different.
Yeah, I mean, some things are changing slowly, I would say. But yeah, because I went to India last year.
Yeah.
After 1 year.
Yeah.
And
Did you grow up in India?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
I came here just for my undergrad.
For undergrad, okay. I see,
Yeah,
okay.
he speaks American, but he's not.
Nice. Yeah.
So
What year did you leave India?
2021.
Okay.
Like
okay.
January.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
So yeah, I went back during the winter break, and even then I was like so shocked. Like so many things changed in my city, like in the course of
Which city is it?
Ahmedabad.
Okay, yeah.
So like so many things had changed in just 1 year. Like so many new places had shown up, like restaurants and like new bridges and like.
Oh yeah.
And like my friends had changed so much, and I was like.
And the people
Yeah,
change.
yeah.
Oh, you're only in the beginning of your reverse culture shock journey.
Yeah.
Every
I
time
think
you
I'll
go
get
back-
it again when I go back.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the countries are, especially India, and I think some countries in South America. I don't know enough about Venezuela's growth. I know Venezuela's had some issues with their governments in the last few years, but a lot of countries have changed quite a bit and quite rapidly in the last few years. So yeah, the reverse culture shock is a very real thing. People don't talk about it again. Like if you talk to professors, to fellow students, no one will talk about this, but everyone is experiencing it. Everyone who's an immigrant is experiencing it.
And at that point, your country is not what it used to be, but you're also not in your country. So you're like, where am I from?
Exactly. Yeah. Oh, that's a very common immigrant thing, right?
Yeah.
You don't belong to either your home country, nor the country you're in. I've personally had experiences where like I'm coming back to the U.S. and some immigration official looks at my passport. This was back when I had an Indian passport before I became a U.S. citizen. Look at my Indian passport. Is that a real passport? I'm like, oh, what do you mean? It's got a real visa on it. So that's on the U.S. side. And then once this happened on the Indian side, where the Indian immigration official looks at my passport and says, "Oh, you're Indian. You don't look Indian." I'm like, okay, maybe that's a compliment. I took it as a compliment. But like, yeah, that goes back to your story, right?
Yeah.
So that, you don't feel in either world, certainly not mentally, right? But I think that also makes immigrants very unique because you're automatically forced into a space where you're alone, in a sense.
I think
And
it makes you more humble.
It makes you humble, but it also makes you unique in your own mind. You know that you're already unique and you have a unique voice and you have a unique story. Every single immigrant story is very different from every other immigrant. Even though you might be two very close friends who grew up together as childhood friends, went to the same college, same school, and then went to the same university in the US, you'll have very different stories, very different recollections of what experiences you went through, right? So I think, going back to the thing I was saying earlier in our conversation, where I think the goal of going to college, or really the goal of life, is to unearth the unique things about yourself. For immigrants, it comes very, very naturally because we are already kind of unique and we are already kind of shooting for the stars in a sense, right? There was this very interesting 2 conversations I had back to back a few years ago. This reminds me of it. So these are 2 students. One was a student who grew up in the US. The other was a student who was an immigrant student. Both were undergrads. I was talking to them, and both the conversations had like a very similar, but the outcomes were different. Conversation went something like this. I asked the student, "Have you thought about grad school?" They're like a junior or senior. They're like, "Oh no, I don't think I want to go to grad school. This is not my cup of tea." I'm like, "Do you know what grad school is?" They're like, "Yeah, I don't know. People do research or whatever." I'm like, "Yeah, have you tried research?" They're like, "Yeah, I've tried research. It's fine. It's okay. But like, I don't know. You have to like pay for grad school. I don't know how that works." I'm like, that if you go do a PhD, you're going to get a scholarship. This is where the conversations diverge. The student who grew up in the US, their reaction was, "Yeah, okay, like, I'm still not interested." And the student who was an immigrant immediately went, "Whoa, I get a prize for doing something that I want to do? Maybe I want to do. I'm going to try that. How do I apply to grad school?" That was the next question that the student asked me. Very different, right? So the immigrant, in my mind, the immigrant is already in very unfamiliar territory where they're reaching for higher goals, and they're already in like way outside their comfort zone. And when they see another prize, they're like, "Okay, I don't know if I like research or not, but it's a prize, so let me go for that," right? And I think those big jumps, those leaps of faith are often sometimes, make a big difference in someone's life, right? Whether it's going for grad school or whether it's like founding a company like Google, at least one of Google's co-founders was an immigrant. Same thing is true of a lot of other, startups and companies. We are already way outside our comfort zone, and we have gotten used to being outside our comfort zone, and that makes big leaps of faith just feel normal. It's like, okay, I'll do that. It's okay.
That's something I experienced. So for some reason, when I moved here in 2016, so beginning of high school, and for some reason something came to my mind. I want to learn English in one day.
Nice.
At that point, I didn't know anything. It was a tough situation. They didn't have a place to live and all these things. And at this point, you might as well fail more,
exactly.
right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And then after that, okay, I didn't do it, but so what? 1 week and 1 month, and at 6 months, I was completely fluent.
Yeah.
And then, okay, what's next? Okay, I want to take AP classes. People, no, you're just crazy. You cannot do that or whatever.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm taking AP classes. And okay, what's next? Okay, I'm going to do research in Fermilab, the particle oscillator.
Yeah.
And then just
do the next big thing.
Yeah. There's something about, in a sense about being immigrant and just for some reason, there's this thing of always shooting for the stars because, we're not even from here. We don't, we fail in many ways.
Right.
And at some point, you just don't care anymore, right?
Right.
But we do. There's some sort of a population bias in the sense because the people you talk to, the people perhaps you talk to and in your podcast and things like that are people who were impacted positively. In a sense.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
For example, my sister also came with me,
Mm-hmm.
and she was affected more by the experience.
Mm-hmm.
In the sense of, she didn't really want to learn English. She wasn't as motivated to in her classes. She wasn't really in her thing. She's doing well now. She's studying college and everything.
Yeah.
But it was a different experience, and I'm sure she's not the only one.
Yeah.
So in your perspective, what do you think makes some people, perhaps like us, shoot for the stars? Who cares? Versus some people it does have not as a positive effect on them. So what do you think makes a difference?
Yeah, I don't know. I think that's a very complex question. I think all immigrants are, by definition, way outside their comfort zone, right? So that makes some of us immediately very willing to shoot for the stars. Not all of us. That's not to say that the people who grew up here don't shoot for the stars. They're very good. The other half of Google's co-founders is an American born and bred American citizen. But then sometimes what happens here is that the social system here is secure, and knowledge of that sometimes makes you less adventurous. You're like, okay, even if I kind of do my little nothing, I'll be fine in life, right? With immigrants, just our lack of knowledge of what the social safety nets are, and sometimes we don't have social safety nets as immigrants, that's true too, makes us sometimes take risks, right? But you're absolutely right. I've actually met, not at work, because at work I face a biased sample set of people who are already motivated and sometimes successful. But then outside, when I interact with people around town, especially at the radio station, which is a community radio station, so it's a fairly random collection of people. The radio station, there's very few people who work at the university. It's all local people. I've met a few among them, including some undocumented immigrants, and their stories are very different from ours. And sometimes they are afraid for what life holds for them. Sometimes, in some cases, that fear motivates them to be adventurous. In other cases, it doesn't. It's a bit debilitating. Some of it boils down to, I think, personality, and so I don't know. I mean, I don't have a psychological explanation for why different people are different. But I think the important thing is that for people who are already way outside their comfort zone, when you take that first step of big leap of faith, the second step is much easier. That first step is sometimes hard, but the second step is much easier than you think it might be. So I think that's what I would say to someone who doesn't want to go outside their shell. take that first step. If you don't like it, go back. Usually they won't go back.
I think that's true, and I think for so since we started this project,
Yeah.
I'm always very like trending things and stuff like that. And maybe have you weren't as much. You were more like doing the right thing.
It was
like,
more intrinsic, but
like Dean's List 4.0 GPA, and still does.
Yeah.
But like now he's like worse than me now. He's just,
worse.
Like like in a sense he's just like way more like crazier in that sense.
And this is a good project to spend your time on. I think it's definitely worthwhile. I mean, I think the thing is also this talk show that you're doing. I think the important thing is you're actually creating a series. You're creating a series of stories where you're talking to individual people, right? So I think that's also a contribution to not just the UIUC community, but overall in general. I don't know of other campuses where there are like human interest or human story podcasts or talk shows like this. I think
I don't think there are many based on students and like this culture of like being in a university. I think there are more like you can find many other podcasts where like people talking about the most random things, but more intellectual ones too, like Friedman or like Joe Rogan or something, right? But I think ours is unique in a way because we are focused more on the things that concern other people at our age,
right,
and who are looking to get answers to questions that most people don't ask until they're maybe like 60 years, 50 years old, right?
Right.
And I think there's a pattern that we are seeing especially is a lot of people at least are starting to think more deeply about their life and the future. And I think being in a campus like this where you have access to so many brilliant people who have had so much experience behind them and so many lessons that they've learned.
Yeah.
I think there could be no better way to learn all of these things and to ask no better people to ask these questions to.
Yeah.
So I think it's really important that you ask these questions and for all these stories to come out. That's why, like, if you look at our guest list too, that it's so diverse because we talk to students and professors and they'll have the most diverse background. Like just last week we talked to an architecture professor and we know next to nothing about architecture. And the reason why we chose to, we reached out to him is because we don't know anything about architecture. So why not learn about it? And his experiences, he was from Budapest, Hungary.
Nice.
So that culture and like how he has spent so many years living here and some in Japan and all the things that he learned and understanding his perspective, it just, you gain so much context and so much so many things that you wouldn't usually learn. Like you can take as many courses as you want, but you're still not going to learn the stories that you do by having a conversation.
Right, yeah. And you kind of vicariously live through that person's experiences as you're listening to their story, right? And any of the lessons that they have learned, maybe in a very painful way over like many years and decades, it's like presented to you on a platter. So that's one of the beautiful things about these conversations. Yeah, I'm very glad you're doing this project. This sounds like when you sent me the invite, I looked at the first few videos. I was like, wow, this is really cool project. This sounds very cool. One of the first interviews I saw was one of your recent interviews. Like that's very cool. And I saw a few more. That was very cool. I'm really glad you're doing this. This is a great project. I hope you keep doing this for a while.
I mean, we are doing this for ourselves. We're curious, and even if we didn't have the cameras, we still do it. I mean, so and we still have a lot of fun, and we get to talk to people like you. So, what else could you ask for?
If you look at the introduction, like the first video that we have, like an introduction video on our page of like what is the UIUC Talkshow, right?
Yes.
And we talk we had a vision of what we wanted it to be like, and I think it's turning out to be that way too. Like I mentioned that every episode is going to have a story which is unique to the person we're talking to, and it's going to teach you something that you wouldn't have learned otherwise. And I think it's starting to be that way too. Like we have progressively seen a pattern where the most common thing we have heard from our guests is to be more curious. And just that feeling or that, I would say, sentiment of following your curiosities is what got them where they are right now. So it's a really good learning experience, I would say. And I would say, even though we only have a like 30 episodes under our belt now, I would say we still learn a lot.
Yeah,
from that.
yeah. I mean, 30 episodes is a lot. I mean, that's a pretty sizable number. And I saw the number of views you're getting. You're getting a healthy number of views in your YouTube videos as well. So I think you're getting some visibility and traction. So keep up the good work. I think you're also you'll find that as you're found already. I'm sure compared to the way you approached your very first interview, compared to your 30th and maybe your 60th interview, you have a very different perspective, right?
Right.
You feel a lot more comfortable for sure, but also you kind of know how to react in a particular interview when it kind of goes off script. Like you have some questions prepared, but the interviewee is throwing up some interesting things. How do you pivot? So that's something that I'm sure you've picked up. So part of the learning process as well. It makes you better communicators as well, which will improve you in your future professional lives if you end up doing something which is not a podcast or a talk show, but it'll also help you in your personal lives, right? So you become better communicators that way. And it sharpens your curiosity, which will help you no matter what.
Yeah.
Right? In all situations. Yeah. Thank you for having me. This was fun. This was great.
Before we end, we have a section called overrated or underrated.
Okay.
So we give you a topic or a statement, and you say underrated or overrated.
Okay.
So Napster, overrated or underrated?
Napster, underrated. I have to say it because I teach Napster in my class. I actually teach how Napster design works. I have to say underrated. Napster is really cool.
Yeah, I was looking at your slides. It's very interesting way how they designed the architecture and how they did it. So very innovative in that sense.
And one of the fun things I say about Napster, I say this in class, is that Sean Fanning was a freshman at Northeastern when he designed Napster. And the reason he called it Napster is because he used to take a lot of naps in school, and his roommates actually nicknamed him Napster. That's why he called it Napster system, and he built it. But yeah, so definitely underrated, Napster. Yes.
Peter Thiel, overrated or underrated?
Peter Thiel, oh my God, overrated for sure. Yes.
Any reasoning?
I would rather not say it on the air.
All right.
But part of it is the stuff that we've talked about in this episode. So those in the know will know why I'm saying overrated. Yeah.
IIT Madras.
IIT Madras. I would say underrated by students who actually go there. Overrated by some US universities. I don't think students who go there appreciate how much they learn. This is not just IIT Madras, but like most of the IITs, they don't appreciate how much they learned, not from just the teachers there, but also from their classmates. I think just that selection process makes it very unique. But also, I think some US universities, when they look at grad applicants, for instance, they just tend to like blindly follow, safe paths, right? Rather than be adventurous and say, oh, no, let's hire a student from a country we have never hired someone from, like, I don't know, Africa, let's look at Nigeria or something, or, eastern part of Europe, So overrated in some cases.
Last one. The Colosseum.
The Colosseum, oh man, I was there just this summer. Underrated for the architectural marvel that it is. Like until someone has been inside that structure, you don't appreciate how much engineering went into just the parts of that structure. Not just the building part, but like even the part that used to bring up the animals for the fight, because they had some very ferocious animals like lions and tigers, and they couldn't have the workers be mauled by them. It's a different matter that the lions actually mauled gladiators. That's a whole different matter. So underrated for the engineering feats that went in there. I don't think the engineers who built the Colosseum are appreciated at all as much as they should be. But overrated for the whole gladiatorial thing. I think that was still very brutal back in those days. And a lot of the things that we see on TV and in movies about, like the Roman emperor giving a thumbs up or a thumbs down when they signal to a gladiator whether they need to be killed or not. It's just not true at all. It's just like made up stuff by Hollywood. So that those parts are all overrated. So Hollywood's depiction of everything in the Roman life is highly, highly, highly overrated and completely inaccurate too.
I think that would be a great place to end. So thank you so much for coming and talking to us and sharing your story.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and all the best as you move forward. And I'm going to be following your journey very closely as we go forward too, because I'm a big fan.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thanks.
And thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed learning more about immigrants, making a podcast, following your curiosity, trying out music, trying things that make you uncomfortable, and not being afraid to fail, right? I think the stories that came out of most of the conversations that you've had and we've had in the past is that you never really know what you want to do until you try it. And there are going to be a lot of failures and a lot of setbacks that you may have. And especially if you're an immigrant and you're in a completely new environment, it can be hard to transition and adapt to that environment. And there can be challenges, but you can still find your community and your niche in everything. I'm really glad that you shared your stories about how you became a better educator and better person by talking to all these people, and how you're still continuing to meet new people and just learn from them. I think this drive to keep learning and sharing all these stories and all this knowledge with so many people, I think it's a great initiative, and I'm really glad that we got this chance to talk with you about it. So thank you very much again for being here. And yeah, stay curious, and we'll see you next time.